You won't believe what this dog did when he found a tiny, helpless kitten abandoned in the rain. No one expected what happened next, and it left everyone speechless. Animals have a way of surprising us. We often think of dogs and cats as enemies, constantly chasing and hissing at each other. But sometimes, nature defies expectations in the most heartwarming ways. This is the story of Charlie, a big, strong rescue dog, and Oliver, a fragile kitten left to die on the streets. What happened when these two crossed paths? Well, it's something you'll never forget. The city never truly sleeps, but on some nights, it feels like it does. This was one of those nights. The rain poured relentlessly, turning streets into rivers, washing away the whispers of the day. The flickering streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and the wind howled through the narrow alleyways like a ghost trapped between the buildings. Most people had long retreated to their warm homes, shutting their doors to the cold, the wet, the loneliness outside. Cars sped past, their headlights slicing through the darkness, but no one stopped. No one looked. No one noticed the tiny bundle of fur huddled in the corner of an alley, pressed against the cold brick wall. A kitten, so small, he barely seemed real. His fur was soaked through, clinging to his frail body. His tiny ribs pressed against his thin skin, rising and falling with each weak breath. His tail curled tightly around himself, as if trying to create some illusion of warmth. But there was none. The cold had settled deep into his bones. His paws trembled, his whiskers twitched. Every now and then, his little mouth would open, and the faintest, weakest meow would slip out, so soft, so fragile that it barely made it past the noise of the storm. But no one heard. No mother came back for him. No warmth, no food, no comfort. Nothing. Just the rain, just the cold, just the silence of being utterly, completely alone. No one knew how he had ended up there. Had his mother been taken from him? Had she been forced to leave him behind, too weak to carry all her babies? Or had a human abandoned him, thinking he was too small, too sick, too much of a burden? He didn't understand why. He only understood hunger, cold, fear. The world was too big for something as small as him. Every shadow was a threat. Every raindrop was a piercing needle against his already freezing skin. He tried to move, tried to find shelter, but his legs wobbled beneath him. He collapsed back against the wall, his energy draining like the puddles around him that disappeared into the cracks of the street. He was fading. Maybe this was how it ended. Maybe the world was just too big, too cruel, too indifferent. Maybe he wasn't meant to survive. And then footsteps, slow, heavy, approaching. Charlie was not a house pet. Not once. Not in his past life. Before he had a home, before he had a warm bed and a loving owner, he was just like this kitten. Alone, forgotten. A stray dog navigating a world that had never been kind to him. He knew hunger, the deep, aching kind that clawed at your ribs, that made you desperate enough to chew on rocks, to search through piles of garbage for something, anything, to fill the void inside. He knew cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, the kind that no amount of shaking could get rid of. He knew loneliness, the kind that made you wonder if you even existed, if anyone would ever see you, ever care. Charlie had been saved once, taken in by a woman named Sarah, given a second chance, a home, love, but some wounds never fully heal. That's why even now, as he walked alongside Sarah, leash in hand, warm and safe, his instincts were still sharp. He noticed the things most humans didn't, the shift in the wind, the scent of fear, and tonight he noticed him. Charlie stopped. Sarah kept walking for a few steps before realizing her dog had frozen, his body stiff. His ears perked. "Charlie," she called, tugging the leash lightly. But Charlie didn't move. His nose twitched. He smelled something. Not food, not danger. Something small, something weak, something helpless. Sarah followed his gaze, squinting into the dimly lit alleyway. And then she saw it. At first, it looked like just a lump of trash, discarded like everything else in the city's forgotten corners. But then it moved, just barely. A tiny, trembling shift. And then a sound. A tiny, barely there meow. Sarah's heart clenched. Oh my God. She took a step forward, but Charlie was faster. He pulled away from her grip, moving toward the tiny creature, his large paw splashing through the puddles, but his steps careful, slow. The kitten didn't react at first. He was too weak, too far gone. But as Charlie got closer, the warmth of the dog's breath brushed against his wet fur, and for the first time in hours, maybe in his entire life, the kitten felt something other than cold. Charlie lowered his massive head, sniffing gently. The kitten barely twitched. Just a weak, exhausted blink, his little chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. A pause, a moment of silence, and then something incredible happened. Charlie whined. It was soft, almost mournful. Not a bark, not a growl, but a sound of recognition, a sound of understanding, a sound that said, "I know this pain." And then, Charlie did something even more unbelievable. He laid down, right there in the middle of the wet street, in the cold and the rain. He stretched his massive body beside the tiny kitten, pressing close, as if offering his own body heat. The kitten's ear twitched at the warmth, a flicker of life, a spark of something. Hope. Sarah watched, her throat tightening. She had seen Charlie protect her before, guard her, love her. But this was different. This was a dog who had once been abandoned, now refusing to let another soul suffer the same fate. She crouched down beside them, carefully reaching out to the kitten. He was ice cold, barely moving. "He won't make it out here," she whispered. Charlie looked up at her, his big brown eyes pleading. "Please." She didn't hesitate. She scooped up the tiny bundle of fur, wrapping him inside her jacket. He barely reacted, too weak to fight. Charlie immediately stood up, pressing his nose against her hands, as if checking to make sure the kitten was still there, still safe. Sarah smiled. "All right, Charlie, let's take him home." And just like that, the kitten's fate changed forever. He was no longer alone. He had been found. He had been saved. But what neither Charlie nor Sarah knew yet was that this was only the beginning, because soon, the bond between this dog and this kitten would become something neither of them had ever imagined. Something deeper, something unbreakable, something called family. Charlie didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, ears slightly pulled back, his body low, moving carefully, almost like he knew how fragile the kitten was. He sniffed. A small, weak scent of life still clung to the tiny creature, buried under the harsh smell of rain, dirt, and fear. Oliver barely reacted. His body was too drained, too weak to fight or flee. His tiny frame barely shivered now, not because he was warm, but because his body was giving up. Then came the faintest sound, a meow so soft, so weak, it was almost just a breath. Maybe it was a cry for help, maybe it was surrender. But Charlie understood something in that sound, something only an animal who had suffered the same loneliness could hear. It was a plea, and Charlie made his decision right there. Gently, ever so gently, he nudged Oliver with his nose. A small push, as if trying to wake him up. The kitten twitched but didn't move. So Charlie did something incredible. He picked him up, not with rough, careless force, but with the same gentleness a mother dog would carry her newborn pup. His massive jaws cradled Oliver's tiny body, careful not to hurt him. And then he turned around and started walking home. Sarah was waiting at the door when she saw Charlie approaching. At first, she didn't understand. "Charlie, what do you have there?" Her eyes widened as she stepped closer, seeing the lifeless little ball of fur hanging from his mouth. A kitten, drenched, barely breathing. Her heart sank. She didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. Instinct kicked in, the way it does when you see something helpless, something that needs you. She knelt down, reaching out carefully. "Give him to me, Charlie," she said softly. Charlie hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening, not to keep Oliver, but as if he was making sure Sarah would be gentle. Then, slowly, he placed Oliver into her hands. The kitten was ice cold. His fur clung to his bony frame. His tiny ribs barely moved with shallow, uneven breaths. He wasn't just cold, he was dying. Without a second to waste, Sarah rushed inside, Charlie following close behind, his eyes never leaving Oliver. She grabbed a soft towel, wrapping the tiny body inside, rubbing gently to bring warmth back into him. His whiskers twitched at the movement, a flicker of life, but still no sound, no resistance. "Come on, little guy," she whispered, worry tightening her chest. "Stay with us." Charlie let out a soft whine, a sound of concern, of helplessness. But Sarah wasn't going to let Oliver go without a fight. For hours, Sarah worked. She dried him off, placed him near a warm heating pad, carefully checking for injuries. Charlie never left. He sat beside the kitten, his tail curled around himself, ears perked at every movement, every flicker of Oliver's whiskers, every twitch of his tiny paws. Charlie was watching. Sarah prepared some warm milk, filling a tiny syringe to feed him drop by drop. At first, Oliver didn't react. Sarah's heart pounded. Was it too late? Then, after what felt like forever, his tiny pink tongue flicked out, tasting the milk. Sarah exhaled sharply. Relief. Hope. "That's it," she whispered. "Come on, baby, drink." Bit by bit, Oliver swallowed, and Charlie's tail gave a tiny wag. The fight wasn't over. but maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The first night was the hardest. Oliver barely moved. His tiny body was still too weak, and every few hours, Sarah woke up to check on him, feeding him small amounts of milk, making sure he stayed warm. But she wasn't the only one keeping watch. Charlie was there, every single second. He lay beside Oliver's small bed, his massive body curled protectively around him. Whenever Oliver whimpered in his sleep, Charlie would nudge him gently with his nose. Whenever Sarah got up to check on the kitten, Charlie would lift his head, eyes filled with worry. And whenever Oliver moved, just the tiniest bit, Charlie's tail would thump against the floor. A small, silent celebration. It was as if Charlie understood something Sarah hadn't fully realized yet. This wasn't just about saving Oliver. This was about giving him a family. Days passed. At first, Oliver was too weak to do much. He mostly slept, curled up in soft blankets, letting Sarah and Charlie take care of him. But then, on the fourth day, something changed. It happened in the middle of the afternoon. Charlie was lying on the floor, watching Oliver sleep, when suddenly, a tiny movement. Oliver stirred, his little paws stretched, his back arched in a tiny stretch, and then, he stood up, wobbly, shaky, but standing. Charlie lifted his head, ears perking up. Oliver blinked at him sleepily, his tiny tail flicking once, and then slowly, he took his first real step in his new home. Charlie's tail wagged like crazy. Sarah gasped, her hands covering her mouth. "He's walking," she whispered. Oliver stumbled forward, his little legs still weak but determined, and he was heading straight toward Charlie. The massive dog lowered his head, watching as the kitten reached him. Oliver paused for a moment, as if thinking. Then, without hesitation, he curled up against Charlie's side. The dog let out a soft, contented sigh. And from that moment on, Oliver was no longer just a rescued kitten. He was family. Their bond only grew stronger. If Oliver tried to climb onto the couch but struggled, Charlie would gently nudge him up. If Oliver wandered too far, Charlie would guide him back with his nose. If Oliver got scared by loud noises, Charlie was right there, standing over him, protective and strong. They ate together, played together, even slept together, Oliver curling up into Charlie's soft fur, as if he belonged there. And Charlie had never been happier. He had been saved once, given a second chance. Now, he had done the same for Oliver, not just as a friend, not just as a guardian, but as a father. One night, something happened that neither Sarah nor Charlie could have expected. Something that would prove, once and for all, that Oliver wasn't just grateful to Charlie. He loved him, and he was about to show it in a way no one saw coming. A quiet evening, that changed everything. The sky was painted in warm shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. A light breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of fresh grass and distant rain. Sarah smiled as she watched Charlie and Oliver walking side by side on the park trail. It had become their little routine. Charlie, with his strong, steady steps, always keeping an eye on Oliver. And Oliver, still small but more confident now, trotting along, his tiny paws patting against the dirt. They weren't just a dog and a cat, they were brothers. Charlie would stop every now and then, looking back, making sure Oliver was keeping up. And Oliver, he would stare up at Charlie, eyes filled with trust, before hurrying after him. Sarah sighed in contentment. It was beautiful, perfect, but life had a way of testing love when you least expected it. And tonight, love was about to be tested. As they neared the open grassy field, the air suddenly felt different, thicker, charged with something unseen, something unsettling. Charlie's ears perked up, his body stiffened. Oliver noticed it too. His tail flicked anxiously, his small frame pressing closer to Charlie's side. Sarah didn't see it at first, but then, a shadow moved. From across the field, a large stray dog emerged. Massive, wild, eyes sharp, body tense. The way he moved low, deliberate. It wasn't curiosity, it was something else. Charlie knew instantly. This wasn't a friendly encounter. This was a threat. Sarah's heart pounded. She instinctively tightened her grip on Oliver's leash. But Charlie, he had already moved. Without hesitation, Charlie stepped forward. Not just in front of Sarah, not just in front of Oliver, but between them and the danger. His stance was firm, his muscles coiled, ready. A deep, low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound that made the ground feel smaller, the air heavier. Charlie was no longer the gentle dog who had carried Oliver home. He was a guardian. The stray dog stopped, ears twitching. His hackles rose, lips curling to reveal yellow teeth. Oliver, small, fragile Oliver, pressed himself against Charlie's hind leg, his tiny body trembling. But he didn't run, not this time, because he knew. He trusted. Charlie wouldn't let anything happen to him. For a moment, there was only silence, a quiet war between two predators. The stray dog was bigger, feral, desperate, but Charlie had something to protect, and nothing fights harder than a protector. His growl deepened, his ears flattened against his skull, his tail was raised, stiff as steel. Every inch of his body screamed, not one step closer. The stray hesitated. He wasn't sure anymore. He had come expecting prey, but what stood before him was something else, something that wouldn't break, something that wouldn't run. The stray took one step forward. Charlie didn't flinch. Instead, he bared his teeth, sharp, gleaming under the dying sunlight. His growl became a snarl, and he lunged forward. It wasn't an attack. Charlie didn't bite. He didn't need to, because the stray dog, a beast hardened by the streets, knew what that movement meant. It was a warning, a promise, a single message, clearer than any bark. You don't want this fight. The stray froze. His eyes flicked from Charlie to Oliver, to the tiny kitten, barely visible behind the giant protector, to the way Oliver stood, not running, not crying, just trusting. The stray hesitated, and then he stepped back, one paw, then another, and then, with one last glance at Charlie, he turned and disappeared into the trees, gone. Charlie stood there for a moment unmoving, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, his body still tense, his mind still alert. Then, after a long pause, he turned. Sarah was staring at him, not in shock, not in fear, but in awe. And then she looked down at Oliver. The tiny kitten was still standing beside Charlie, pressed against his fur, his eyes wide, ears perked, but he wasn't afraid, not anymore. Sarah felt her throat tighten. It was in that moment that she realized Charlie hadn't just protected Oliver. Charlie had adopted him, not as a pet, not as a friend, but as his own. A father protecting his child, a guardian shielding his family, a dog who had made a choice. That night, as they walked home, Oliver stayed even closer to Charlie. Something had changed. It wasn't just protection anymore. It was bonded trust. And Sarah could feel it. When they got home, Oliver, usually playful before bedtime, did something unexpected. He walked up to Charlie, paused, and then he nuzzled against Charlie's leg. A small, gentle thank you. A moment so simple, yet so powerful. Sarah smiled, wiping a tear before it could fall. This wasn't just an unusual friendship. This was love. Real, pure, undeniable love. And no matter what came next, Charlie and Oliver would always have each other. A dog and a cat, once strangers, now family, forever. Seasons changed. The crisp chill of winter softened into the warmth of spring. The days grew longer, the sunsets more golden. And in that time, Oliver had transformed. He was no longer the frail, helpless kitten Charlie had carried home that stormy night. Now Oliver was strong, confident, a little mischievous even. He would chase after butterflies in the backyard, his tiny paws kicking up dust as he leaped through the grass. He had learned how to climb, first the couch, then the kitchen counter, and eventually, even the tallest tree in the yard. But no matter how big or brave he became, one thing never changed: his love for Charlie. Charlie had taught Oliver everything: how to explore, how to play, even how to be patient when Sarah scolded them for knocking over a flower pot, which, to be fair, was mostly Oliver's fault. But more than that, Charlie had taught Oliver what it meant to be safe, because Oliver had never known that before. He had never known what it was like to wake up every morning and know that someone would be there for him, that he would never be alone again. And Charlie, he had once been that same lost soul, wandering the streets, waiting for someone to care, until Sarah saved him. And now he had done the same for Oliver. Maybe that's why their bond was so strong, because they understood each other. They knew what it was like to be abandoned, and they knew what it meant to be found. Every evening, after a long day of playful chaos, Oliver would curl up beside Charlie, just like he did when he was small. Sometimes, he would nuzzle his head under Charlie's chin, purring softly. Other times, he would tuck himself between Charlie's front paws, using his fur like a pillow. It didn't matter how old he got. That was his home. Charlie never pushed him away, never got tired of him. He would simply sigh, rest his head beside Oliver's, and close his eyes, his heartbeat steady, calm, and constant. And Oliver would listen, because that was the sound of love, a rhythm that had saved him once, and would stay with him forever. Sarah often wondered how it happened, how two completely different creatures, from two completely different worlds, had become inseparable. Was it fate, luck, some unspoken rule of the universe that binds lost souls together? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure: it was real. Charlie and Oliver weren't just a dog and a cat. They weren't just a story of survival. They were proof that love has no boundaries, no rules, no limits. Animals don't see differences the way we do. They don't care about labels like dog or cat. They don't ask where you came from. They don't judge you for your past, for your scars, for the things that made you afraid. They don't look at your flaws. All they see is who you are now. And that's what makes them so special. One day, Sarah sat outside, watching as Oliver climbed onto Charlie's back, swatting at his ears playfully. Charlie sighed, pretending to be annoyed, but his tail wagged, a silent giveaway of how much he loved it. Sarah smiled, and then she thought about all the people in the world who had forgotten how to love like this. People who built walls instead of bridges. People who saw differences before they saw hearts. People who walked past those in need, just because they weren't the same. If only they could be more like Charlie, more like Oliver. If only they could understand what these two had always known, that in the end, love is all that really matters. And sometimes, the purest, most unconditional love comes from those who can't even speak a word. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more amazing animal stories. See you in the next one.